Welcome to the September Academy Program of the North American Unitarian Association. NAUA is dedicated to supporting and promoting the practice of liberal religion by embracing freedom, reason, and tolerance, rooted in our commitment to the inherent worth and dignity of every person and all peoples. The NAUA Academy offers monthly programming on issues of concern from our liberal religious perspective. My name is Terry Anderson. I'm a member of the NAU Academy Advisory Board and on the board of the NAUA. I'm joining you from Edmonton, and I see many of you have added your location, but feel free to do that if you wish. Now, I can see getting a little bit of background. It might be a good time for everyone to mute their microphones. So today's presenter is Dr. Mark Riemers, and we can spotlight him. Welcome, Mark. We're delighted to have you spend time to come to the Academy with us. Dr. Mark Riemers is a quantitative neuroscientist researching how dynamic brain activity gives rise to thoughts and feelings. Dr. Reimer has worked at the U.S. National Institute of Health and Karolinska Institute of Stockholm, the Virginia Institute for Psychiatric and Behavior Genetics, and at Michigan State University. His broader aim is to ground our understandings of feelings and thought in the facts of biology. Dr. Riemers was the leader of the Richmond Humanists in Virginia for 5 years and the leader of the UU Forum in Lansing, Michigan for 6 years. He speaks frequently at humanist and science outreach events in Michigan and internationally. Additionally, allow me to tell you about the October Academy program, which is scheduled for the second Tuesday of the month. We shifted from the second Tuesday as we usually do because of the debate last week, but we'll be back on our usual second Tuesday on October the 8th. So at this time, I will turn the virtual microphone over to Mark, and let's see, can we highlight him? Spotlight.
Great. Well, thank you, Terry. And thank you all for joining me. I'd like to lay out today some thinking I've been doing on a topic that I think many of you have also been thinking about, which is the past and present and future of humanism. How has humanism changed, and is it are we going in the direction we'd like to go? So this talk will be in 3 parts, and I like to sort of break up my talks with question and answer. So there'll be, not surprising, it'll be like Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. So, but each time there'll be an intermission where you can ask questions or raise objections or debate as you see fit. And I'm going to ask Terry to moderate those sections. And I'll try to give you a more broad and worldwide, deeper view of the history of humanism and how it came about. I'll advance some perhaps controversial notions about the present of humanism, which you are welcome to dispute, and nothing else depends on them if you disagree with them. Nothing else that I say depends on those. And then finally, I want to articulate a vision for the future of humanism that I think could revitalize humanism and bring us back into the main intellectual currents of science and humanist thought. So let me get started then with sharing screen. And I think you can see the screen now. Is that right? Everyone can see?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. So as I mentioned, this is the outline of 3 parts. There'll be a question and answer after every part. So let's start with humanist roots. And I want to emphasize here that humanism is not simply a Western phenomenon. And in particular, I think that we can find antecedents to humanism just about every culture where thoughtful people have discussed human lives and how they might live better, tried to solve problems and explain events in rational terms. I've highlighted here a picture of the San people. It's common in the West for us to think of traditional or so-called primitive peoples as somehow unsophisticated. But it's really remarkable how knowledgeable and how logical and many of the traditional peoples are. One of the striking observations of the first Western anthropologists to live with the Bushmen, which is their preferred name for themselves, it was that how unsuperstitious and how rational they were, that they thought out why things might happen a particular way and what motivated a person. They didn't believe in ghosts. They didn't believe in spirits. They didn't believe in magic. They didn't have witchcraft. They were quite remarkable compared to the people around them in terms of their ability to think rationally. And so I think we should recognize and respect the long-standing rational traditions in many traditional societies. Now, they did not leave much in the way of written records. The first written records we have from the ancient world in the West and then in other parts of Asia, most of the texts we have from the ancient world are, pretty dull. They're either long lists of items for an administrator, or they may be some religious poetry. But there are mixed amongst these things that we don't care about, a number of secular texts which discuss human life and give practical advice to people who want to live happy lives. Probably the earliest we have is 4,500 years ago old. That's the Maxims of Ptahhotep. But there are a number of others. In particular, the Councils of Wisdom was regularly copied out by scribes as an exercise. So we have hundreds of copies of that. And the Wisdom of Amenemope, which sounds an awful lot like the Book of Proverbs, even though it's about 600 years earlier. But they're all very secular books of advice talking about, what are the consequences of acting in certain ways? How can you, maximize your professional success? Some of it's just standard career advice, but how can you be a decent human being as well? And that's pervasive in the ancient world, in the West and in the East. We usually think of humanism beginning with the Greek miracle of maybe the 6th or 5th century BCE, depending on which authors you're thinking of. But I think it's worth understanding how this so-called Greek miracle came about. How is it that suddenly these Greek-speaking peoples who had just recently expanded into Asia Minor, how is it that they started formulating ideas that resonate with us down through the ages? And some of it has to do with the fact that this is pretty rugged landscape. It's easy to get away from people who are pains in the ass. You can find your own cove, your own valley, and get away. So it's hard to enforce draconian rule or totalitarian rule. Not impossible, but just hard. Furthermore, these are all islands on a relatively placid coast. So they developed seagoing ships fairly early. And in fact, they developed trade networks throughout Asia Minor and the Aegean Sea. And one of the things that they invented quite early on, in particular in Lydia, one of these Greek cities, was money. Now, let's not sort of get sidetracked about all of the evil things that associated with money, but money does facilitate trade. And it made all of these Ionian cities real centers of trade. So what does trade do? It makes you meet people and interact with people who don't think like you, who have different religious beliefs, who have different politics, who accept different things taken for granted in their culture. And you have to think about this. Can I work with someone who doesn't believe in Zeus or Artemis? Can I believe in someone who doesn't believe in the Great Mother? These are the kinds of questions that people would have to deal with on a regular basis. And in dealing with those, they began to think for themselves. Again, we take for granted the ability to write, but it really was the alphabet, which was invented, we think, by Semitic contractors in Egypt who were trying to copy some aspects of hieroglyphics and simplify them, who invented what we now think of as the alphabet. And many Greek merchants became literate in order to run their businesses. And many of these merchants were also speculative philosophers. So Thales was quite an effective olive oil merchant, but he also proposed the fundamental idea that matter could change form, that maybe there weren't necessarily four elements, as many people thought, but that matter could be something enduring in matter could change appearance. So he thought in particular that water became air as it evaporated and then fell as rain, something which is not quite so far from the truth. A little later on, Democritus proposed that everything was made of small uncuttable particles which clung together in various ways by hooks. Again, he had the details wrong, but he had a fundamental idea. And within a century, we have what we call the golden age of Greek humanism. And of course, we know Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but I think it's worth also considering people like Herodotus. So whereas there had been people writing history for thousands of years before Herodotus, they always wrote it in terms of the actions of gods, or gods granting the pharaoh some magnificent victory, or God, the gods on the side of the king, the Sumerian kings or the Assyrian kings, smiting their enemies. But Herodotus said, well, why did these warriors win these battles? Why did these political events happen? He didn't invoke the gods. He's tried to explain the cultures and customs of the people, the geography, what kind of land they had and how that influenced their decisions, and their history, what kinds of things that happened to them in the past. He tried to find human causes for human events. And as far as I know, this is the first time in history, in any historical writing, that anybody had tried to explain human events entirely in human terms. We all know the name of Socrates, and we certainly know that he questioned conventional pieties. Do we know what kinds of pieties? He wasn't just pricking the balloons of religious fanatics. He was questioning what we would call the liberals. He was questioning the self-congratulatory liberals of his time, and asking whether Athenian democracy was really so great. But we know of him as a great debater and a logician, and someone who exposed the fallacies of his opponents. But that's only one side of him. He was also known in his time as a great conversationalist and listener, someone who really was interested in other people, and had some memorable conversations with people from all walks of life. He was well known for that. And then finally, of course, Aristotle, of course, is known as a philosopher, but he's really the first person to try to systematize all of human knowledge and try to bring it all together in one place and make it accessible to at least every person with leisure for study. Now, I focused here primarily on the Western tradition, which we derive most of our humanist ideas from. But I'd like to highlight two other traditions, which are almost as deep, almost as far back. First is Buddhism from India, which is very different from anything in the West, in that it's trying to expose the inner workings of the mind. It's trying to do a kind of psychology thousands of years before we have the idea of scientific psychology, but trying to systematically reflect in ways that many of the 19th century psychologists copied later. And then, again, we think of Confucianism as a very dry and stultified tradition, but in its time, Confucian thinking was trying to overthrow the stranglehold of the nobility on Chinese politics and try to argue for a group of sort of technocrats, people who were well trained in administration, to take over from the day-to-day administration from the nobles who were doing such a bad job of it. And in thinking about that, Confucius was trying to articulate principles of social harmony and social relationships that would enable people to do a good job. Now, all of these were long ago, and none of them called themselves humanists. But the first people who took the name humanists were in the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was a time when people were rediscovering the learning of the ancient world. So very few people outside the church spoke Latin or read or wrote Latin. But the humanists had rediscovered classical Roman literature, and they tried to teach citizens to speak and write with the kind of eloquence that the classical authors had used. And the aim was to get them to engage well in civic life, to try to defang the party politics that was rife in all of the Italian cities at that time, and try to have clear debates about clear issues. I think we could learn something from them today. And the way that they were going to accomplish this was through what they called the studia humanitatis, the study of humanity. And that was, learning how to speak well and write well, but also learning history and thinking about moral philosophy. Today in universities, we call the humanities those subjects that have descended from their initial curriculum. Now, we don't necessarily think of humanism today as entirely the same as the humanism of the Renaissance, because we've had in between the rise of science and the rise of a kind of critical approach to history after the Middle Ages and religion. So in particular in science, we have mechanical ideas like Newton's laws displacing religious ideas about how the heavens work, about why the stars seem to rotate about us, and about how life on Earth got started. At the same time, the textual methods, the study of texts that the humanists of the Renaissance had pioneered was applied to many religious texts, and many scholars came to compare the writings of the religious writings with other contemporary writings, other myths, other stories, and decided that perhaps the Bible itself was not necessarily word for word, the word of God, but was a document compiled from many sources. And by the 19th century, many Christians were struggling to think about, how could they integrate the new science with their faith, and how could they integrate the new critical approach to the sources of their faith. And so we had in the 19th century, a number of attempts to try to synthesize scholarship, historical scholarship, science, and religious aspiration. And I've listed a few of these, both in the UK and in the United States. Many of you know George Eliot as a novelist, but she was also a very serious scholar and a humanist, and translated many of the critical historical works like Renan's Life of Jesus from French into English. Many of these others are known to you. Felix Adler, John Dietrich, and both played roles in founding humanist organizations. And John Dewey really put together a coherent idea of secular humanism. The British Humanistic Religious Association, which was probably the first of those, promoted knowledge of arts and sciences. It was not necessarily an ideological organization. It was, like the Renaissance humanists, an opportunity for hard work. It was, people had to learn about science. They had to learn about the arts. And like the Renaissance humanists, they also included women as equal members, which was unusual in the Victorian era as it was in the late Middle Ages. And so we come to 1933, where there's the first Humanist Manifesto. And at this point, people are still thinking primarily in terms of saving the best of the Christian faith, trying to make it compatible and integrated with science and scholarship. And so they're saying that, science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs, but the goal of humanism, as they saw it, was to establish a kind of new religion that could be a synthesizing and force for the world that they lived in. But I think it's important to think about how one more thing. The humanists of the early 20th century were very concerned about economic justice. In fact, the 14th affirmation of the first Humanist Manifesto was explicitly socialist. It has not aged very well, but many of those early humanists were at least communist sympathizers and were certainly committed to socialism as an ideal. That was probably the most divisive section of the first Humanist Manifesto. But finally, it ended with this affirmation that man is at last becoming aware that he alone is responsible for the realization of the world of his dreams, and that he has within himself the power for its achievement. That statement strikes us as very overconfident today. And I'd like to think next about how that happened and why. But let me pause here and take questions and objections. So Terry, if you could call on people, then we'll.
Yes, so I hope everyone knows how to raise their hand. If you're not sure, if you go under React button down at the bottom, there is one called Raise Hand. And we'll take them roughly in the order that they were given. I mean, the order that you raise your hand.
Sure.
And because it's always hard to ask the first question, I'll take the second question first. Go ahead, Dick, the second question.
Well, I guess when I look at the word humanism, I grew up thinking of humanism, or I learned to mean that it was not viewed as an alternative to theism or supernatural view of the world. It was a view of the world that says, it's like sort of what you're talking about in human terms. But my feeling was it was in opposition to the Christian theology and other kinds of similar theologies. But today, my sense is that humanism has gone beyond that, or maybe we're using different words to go beyond this sort of old dichotomy. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I think that what modern humanism has become is somewhat different than what the early 20th century humanists envisioned. And I'm just saying that they explicitly envisioned a kind of religion. And about half of the signatories to the first Humanist Manifesto were Unitarian ministers. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them were religious humanists of various sorts. So I think that's what it's fair to say they had in mind. Whether or not their vision is preserved or whether it could be preserved is what I'll get to next. So I think you're right that today humanism often thinks of itself as opposition to religion, but if we look back at its founding, and I think it's important to look back at the founding because many of the ideas and ways of thinking that were first formulated 100 years ago are still with us and may need to be re-examined critically.
Good. Well, thank you for that question. Let's turn next to Ron and then Julie.
Just a really quick and maybe minor footnote. I just happened to have completed a book by Josephine Quinn. She's a historian out of Oxford, and she wrote about how the world made the West. And she takes a strong position that we jump immediately to the Greek and Romans as kind of setting the foundation for the development of the West, Europe specifically. And she makes a very strong argument that we need to look more closely at the Phoenicians and then all the way back to Zoroastrian development 1,000 years earlier. And just she doesn't talk about the development of humanism. I'm extrapolating from what she said to that point. And for just a simple example, that people, even though there was a strong orientation towards looking at, quote, the gods, Zoroastrian thinking was really interesting. They had a good god and a bad god, but it was almost secondary. Their key principles, I'm just going to make sure I read them correctly here, is to have good thoughts, to speak good words, and to perform good deeds. I would argue there's an element of humanist thinking all the way back to that time frame. So I just wanted to add that we tend to start with the Greeks, but really there's sub foundations beyond that in the Mediterranean and Asian area that says thinking along these lines started earlier.
Yeah, I've not read the book you have and you've mentioned. I know of it, but from what you say, I fully agree with your comments that the Greeks had many antecedents. It wasn't a miracle that just sort of like flowers blooming in the desert. It was drawing on many other cultures, but they were in a unique position, not because of some intrinsic genius, but because of the material situation. They were able to talk with so many different people. And, they were in a unique position to be able to have to scratch their heads and think, how can I trade both with the people who believe in Zeus and the people who believe in Isis and the people who believe in the Great Mother goddess? How can I keep my sanity and trust all of these people as I need to? So I think I think she's right that there's a great deal more to Western culture than just the Greeks.
Okay, well,
Really?
thank you. Let's turn next to Julie.
Mark, I'm glad this thing's being recorded because the slides are speeding along here. Could you read the last sentence of your last slide? Something about human achievements. I think I was having a response to that, but I didn't finish reading it.
Sure. So let me read it again. So this is from the Humanist Manifesto. Man is at last becoming aware that he alone is responsible for the realization of the world of his dreams, and that he has within himself the power for its achievement. So that's actually the last sentence of the Humanist Manifesto 1.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you mentioned that it had been questioned once, and certainly I question it too. Would you say how it's been questioned historically since then, what you were referring to there?
Well, actually, I'm going to talk about that in 2 minutes in the section of Humanism Present. But
Never
just
mind.
briefly, I think that that's a world of sort of positivist optimism. It's a world that we can make it. It's almost like manifesting our thoughts, a very American idea. And it's not necessarily a surprise that this kind of humanism really hasn't gone much beyond the Anglo-American world. There are humanist organizations in many other countries, but as a proportion of the intellectual population, it's been much smaller. So I'll come to more of that. Any other questions or comments? I think we're at about 7 minutes anyway, so maybe we should move on to the next section. Terry, shall I move on to the next section?
Sure, but if I could just add or a comment is that
Sure.
it strikes me, especially when you're talking about the hand people, that as the science or rational thinking got more and more powerful, it's kind of edged out the theistic kind of views that God's got less important until and maybe they've gone completely away. But then it seems like that when we talk about the word religious humanism, it's almost an oxymoron in some ways. But or at least I sense it is. And um, I guess I wonder if it's just, people who use that term are really just afraid to abandon the theistic looks or the feel or the history that way, or I just always have had trouble really understanding what the term religious humanist means.
I think that's a fair question. I can't speak for all of the people who use the term religious humanist, but I think many of them feel that religion has been, has been a focus of so much human energy that has, that it must be trying to address some fundamental issues in the human psyche. Whether you believe there's so-called a God-shaped hole in the human soul, which I do not, but I do believe that there are many, sort of evolved social needs that human beings have that religion has often partly fulfilled enough to, keep it going. Now, how much of that can be preserved, how much of that should be preserved is, I think, a matter for real discussion and debate. But I wouldn't dismiss the religious humanists out of hand.
Okay, thank you. Especially when you hear so many of the authors of that first manifesto were in fact professional religious, if you like.
Yeah, most of them were. Okay, so let's come back to, all right, you can see things again.
Looks good.
All right. Okay, so at the turn of the 20th century, so a century and a quarter ago, it seemed that humanism really could be, or this religious humanism really could be, the religion of the future. And many intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century called themselves humanists and promoted humanism in various forms, but it doesn't seem to be so fashionable today. So I want to start by suggesting, and this is, of course, this is controversial, that there were a couple of critical weaknesses in the 20th century's vision of humanism. And the first, I think, was this idea that once humanity had grown up, that somehow we had come out of our adolescence and we were ready to assume the adult mantle of responsibility for ourselves and for our planet and for the future, and that just once we cast off all of the religious dogma and the myths and superstitions, everything would be fine. That was the problem. Many humanists thought that it was, that religious dogma was the problem, and many humanists today think so. That somehow, if we got rid of religious dogma, we would end up in some glorious future where human potential would naturally be unleashed. And I think that this depends in turn on a kind of optimistic and almost self-congratulatory view of human nature, which I think we owe to the American transcendentalists, people like Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman, who made these kind of bold claims about human potential, which really resonated with many Americans in the 19th century. But I think that along the way, they forgot, one of the, I think, fundamental maxims of Renaissance humanists, and certainly even of the Enlightenment. And I've just, summarized this in a quote from Immanuel Kant: out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, which is, we are such fallible and easily deceived and easily self-deceived human beings, and always promoting our own interests, that we don't really naturally fit into this sort of glorious vision of the future. So, and of course, the Renaissance humanists studied both the evils of humanity as well as the glories of humanity. So I think that this kind of optimism was inherently fragile. And that's my first controversial point, I suppose. And I think many people would disagree with that, but I think that this kind of focus on, it's within our power. We just have to manifest, think through these things, and we will, achieve the world that we've all dreamed of. And I think very few people would say such things with a straight face today. A few would, but I think two things really destroyed the optimism, or destroyed the credibility of that optimism. And the first was the terrible wars of the 20th century, where all of the human sciences, chemistry, and then physics were used to the destruction of life as much, rather than for the enhancement of life. And the second thing that perhaps came after the Second World War really came to human consciousness was the terrible pollution, that the way we had destroyed so much of the natural world. So the photograph at the top is New York City on a day in early 1970s. It's much cleaner now. You rarely find this kind of smog, but it was every day. You would normally, crest the top of a hill coming into Denver and see this massive dome of brown over, or Salt Lake City, or any of the hills of or Los Angeles, or any of the cities of the West. And then, of course, there were rivers were like the river at the bottom were filled with garbage and foam of various kinds of unhealthy chemicals. I think many of us may still remember some of those days. Some of us are probably too young, but it's remarkable how much our air and water have been cleaned up since then. But at the same time, so we've had some success with pollution itself, but we have not had such success with dealing with the loss of the natural environment itself. That many populations of wild animals are plunging. Certainly in North America, we have lost something like 60% of all birds over the past generation. In Africa, they're losing, it seems to have lost about 80% of elephants over the past 50 years. These are pretty serious problems that we haven't really solved. And that also saps the idea of this is all done by humans for human ends. So it's not so clear that the kind of optimism and self-creating agenda that the Humanist Manifesto embodied is really that different from the kind of voracious capitalism that has devoured so much of the world. So I think that has also sapped the attraction of humanism, and there are a couple of manifestations of that. So first, we find that humanism as a distinctive label is not, or as a movement, is not much engaged, is not really attracting the best scientific minds. So we find lots of people thinking about fundamental issues in, for human society, for human intelligence, for human ethics. The Institute for the Future thinks about, big problems and what can be done about them. And they largely ignore the Anglo-American humanist tradition. For them, people like John Dietrich are really minor historic curiosities rather than founders of a coherent movement that they work within. Some of them even call themselves new humanists, which was in fact the name of the sort of house organ of the Unitarian ministers who signed the first Humanist Manifesto. So there's now you can Google this. There's now a whole set of new humanist presentations and debates and discussions. A lot of them sponsored by John Brockman, who's written a number of books from these. But these largely ignore humanism as we know it. They call themselves humanist, but that's because they're thinking in the Renaissance terms. They're trying to study human nature and what the possibilities of human nature and human society are. But they find the humanism that has been the mainstay of Unitarian Universalist churches for a century. They find that irrelevant. It's not giving them any ideas. It's not holding up any standards that they need to aspire to. At the same time, many working class people have largely tuned out. They think of humanism as some sort of conspiracy or plot to undermine their faith or their lifestyle. They feel that it's not speaking to them. So we've lost both the intellectuals and the common people. Now, I think that, and again, this is very controversial, and I can't necessarily speak for all the motivations of everyone involved, but it's, I would say there's been three main responses to this loss of humanist confidence by the humanist organizations. And I think the first is that humanism has evolved from the confident and almost dogmatic language of the first Humanist Manifesto to being much more New Agey and much more of a lifestyle choice. So that's, in fact, that's the way the Humanist Manifesto 3 describes it, as a lifestyle rather than as a commitment or as a something requiring study or effort. You don't find effort or study in Humanist Manifesto 3. You do find them in Humanist Manifesto 1. People thought that their vision then was worth struggling for. Here we're just trying to live and let live in Humanist Manifesto 3. I think that is one big change, accommodating American individualism, or I think another big change in starting sometime in the 80s or 90s is that many humanist organizations found a kind of a mission in opposing religion, rather than articulating a vision for what society could be, and how human beings could live together. They drummed up support and got donations, I think, by talking about how bad the religious right was, how the moral majority, which really became a major force in American politics in the 1980s. And I'm no fan of the moral majority, and I'm glad that that particular organization's largely disintegrated, although many other organizations have taken their place. But that's not really a mission or a vision. You're saying that these people are bad, and if you support the AHA, you're fighting these people. And all of the appeals I get from the AHA for money emphasize how much they're fighting the religious right. Well, I'm no fan of the religious right, but that's not a vision for an alternative future. And then I think in the last 20 years, many humanist organizations have, and this was, I think, put very well, so many humanist organizations have adopted a sort of progressive politics. And this was put very well by a friend of mine who was a Richmond, an activist, humanist activist in Richmond. He said, he was showing up to protest against the religious right, and he noticed that other people were always showing up at the same protests with different organizations. And those might be various, progressive organizations, LGBTQ organizations or anti-racist organizations or what have you. And he said, that's when we thought we should make common cause with these groups. So they've adopted, I think, identity politics in particular as a way to try to remain relevant. And I think that's, some of you may have been paying attention to some of the chaos of the American Humanist Association during the year from 2021 to 2022, 2023. It's been quite a rough ride for them. They have, like many progressive organizations, they've ended up in, lots of internal battles over, what language to use, and things that have distracted, I think, from their main goals. So I think that, I don't expect you all to agree with me, but these are what I think have been the responses, but I don't think that they are adequate. And I'd like to try to explain, what I think might be adequate in the next section. But let's pause here for you to ask questions or to disagree with me.
Okay, and please raise your hand again. I'm sure that somebody was either offended or thinks that Mark is right on those observations about today. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Just a comment. I haven't been closely monitoring what's been going on with the National Humanist Association. I just know that the Unitarian Humanists really adopted identity politics, and to their detriment, it seems like they've just kind of evaporated as an organization. So as the National Humanists, they've run into the same thing. I wasn't aware of that.
I don't know it's the same thing, because I've noticed that the Unitarian humanists seem to have disappeared from my radar, which I've missed.
Right, they've evaporated.
Yeah. So yes, what happened with the AHA is that they decided to hire some very prominent anti-racist activists.
Of course, they did.
And that seems to have resulted in a major implosion in the organization. They basically, what I see, which is not necessarily, I've had a kind of ringside seat because I give a lot of talks for AHA, and so I sort of listen, hear about the politics, internal politics, sort of in the background and on the phone. Is that they basically, these people they hired basically hijacked the entire organization for their agenda, and there was.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was and Julie put in an article, I think it was Michelle Goldberg, The Left's Fever is Breaking, which addresses this issue, and I would recommend that. Any other thoughts, comments, disagreements, questions? And John, maybe if you and I want to restart the Unitarian Humanists, we should think about a way to do that without identity politics.
The problem is we'll immediately be called Nazis.
Well, I know that. You have to have a thick skin.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'm curious. Okay, so these humanist organizations are taking on progressive politics. Are they becoming sort of like partisan political parties?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Are these as these humanist organizations were taking on progressive politics? Are they becoming sort of like partisan political parties?
I think that's fair to say. Now, whether you think that's
charities?
A good thing, huh?
Aren't they charities? Like a 501c type thing, where they're not supposed to be in partisan politics?
Yeah. So that's yes, that is a contradiction. But I mean, I think we can. I'd be surprised if anyone on this call was a Trump supporter, but if I think that it's fair to say that the AHA has become very partisan toward Democrats, and whereas I think 20 years ago, you could easily find lots of Republicans in the party, probably not too many Republicans who would end up on the side of Trump, but Republicans who had somewhat different views than many of us more liberal people, but and consistent and thoughtful views. I knew several of them, and I'm sorry that they've kind of been driven out, both of the Unitarian Church and of the AHA.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeff. And Deandra, go ahead.
I'm curious, Mark, if you think that there's also a bit of backlash. I kind of observing a bit of backlash nationally in terms of anti-intellectualism and kind of questioning science. And etc. So, how much of that do you think is influencing the current environment for humanism and the path that not only humanist organizations, but even churches that used to have a strong humanist dimension to them, like the Unitarian Church, they have kind of moved beyond that and disavowed it, so to speak?
That's a good question, Deandra, and I'm not sure that I can give a good answer to it. I think we've seen quite vividly how many right-wing influencers have explicitly tried to cast aspersions on science, tried to kick dust over science, but I think it's also the case that many Democrats, many people on the left, have also become more skeptical of science. Excuse me. A lot of anti-vaccine activism was on the left as much as the right. So I think that there's been, an erosion of trust in science, and I think it's partly because science has often been the wrapper for many political agendas, and people haven't been necessarily very discriminating about what is something described in scientific terms, like a particular food additive or a particular chemical process, or does that make it science? Well, not really. It means that science is being used as part of the advertising for a particular agenda, and I think that people have become more skeptical of science because of its use in various kinds of political and commercial agendas, as much as because of a general lack of knowledge. I mean, I think that the quality of scientific teaching has probably decreased. At least I'm finding with my students that their numeracy skills are very definitely less than they were 20 years ago. And as far as I can tell, that's true across the sciences. Their level of scientific knowledge is much less than it was 20 years ago. So I think that's a combination of the expansion of science, the shrinking of the educational, of how much education there's been, and also the politicization of science. That's not a good answer. I wish I could give you a better answer. Any other questions, or shall we go on to the future, or at least one vision of the future?
Okay, let's go ahead to the ghost of humanism future. Go ahead.
All right. Ghost of humanism future. Okay, so let's get this. Okay, you are seeing my screen or not?
We are.
Okay. All right. So I'd like to propose that the way to revitalize humanism is both by re-engaging with the concerns that motivated the Renaissance humanists, and also with a serious engagement with modern science. And the aspect of Renaissance humanism that I would like to emphasize is their determination to learn from the best sources they could find. So they had just rediscovered the literature of the ancient world. They had rediscovered beautiful expression, eloquence. They had rediscovered analysis of human events in human terms. And they wanted to bring that to their world, the late Middle Ages, early modern world, and to use it to better their own condition. So I'd like to propose sort of 4 pillars or 4 key themes that humanism, I think, needs to embrace, that draw on the best knowledge that we have. And the first is ecology, understanding the natural world. The humanists of prior eras, even the early 20th century, really had very little idea about the interconnected web of life, as the 7th Unitarian principle used to say, that they didn't understand how all of the different parts of life fit together, and how their actions in building new chemical plants or building new highways had reverberating effects through many hundreds of different species and could shape the landscape in ways that were beyond the immediate impact of a clearing of a road or clearing of a field for a chemical plant. And I think that it's worth actually studying and learning this for everybody. I don't think that this should be, that understanding the natural world should be just the province of ecologists or environmental activists. I think this is something that should be part of every human being's education now. And interestingly enough, I think that it's clear that most traditional people really do understand much about the relationships between the different plants and animals in their environment. They don't necessarily know all the quantitative ecology that modern science has illuminated, but they do understand how the different parts work together, even if they don't know what the overall balance of nature would be. So I think that this is something that we could teach and learn even from an early age, and learn to appreciate both our local environment and the plants and animals around us, but also then broaden it to an appreciation or an understanding of the role of various species around the world. Now, one idea that has become very prominent in both deep ecology and among some humanists who are inspired by deep ecology has been the idea of Gaia, the Earth as a sort of self-regulating, or life on Earth as a self-regulating system. This is associated with James Lovelock, but also several other people contributed to this. I think many people think that the idea of Gaia can link humanism and deep ecology. To my mind, the problem is that it's still really unclear how valid the Gaia concept is, and I expect some of you will disagree. So let's say it's clear, and I think well agreed on now, that life does affect the environment, that microorganisms break down certain kinds of rocks, that plants do produce, put oxygen into the atmosphere, which is otherwise unstable. That all of these things, in many ways, life does affect the physical environment and chemical environment. That's the weak sense of Gaia, and I think that's, at this point, pretty uncontroversial. The strong sense that makes it almost a quasi-religious concept is the idea that life can regulate the physical and chemical environments so as to preserve itself. And that's, I think, very hotly contested, and I certainly don't believe in it, and I think there's plenty of good examples, such as the snowball Earth of 500 million years ago, or the great oxygenation event of 2.5 billion years ago, where life practically extinguished itself through its own chemical processes. We may be in a similar kind of situation now. Hopefully we can avert it. So I don't think Gaia is going to be the royal road to resolving the fundamental dilemma, which is how do we balance human needs with those of the natural world? I think we will have to accept that there will be inevitably trade-offs, and we don't really at this point know enough to get it right. But I think we can, make reasonably informed decisions about many things. In particular, of course, about carbon dioxide and methane and other, things that are changing the overall environment. But I think we can also make, decisions about land use that take into account what we already know about, say the behavior of elephants or the needs of wolves and deer and coyotes in North America. So I think that the first pillar then is an understanding of nature. And the second, I think, is an understanding of where we fit into nature, in particular, the biological basis of human nature. And I'd like to highlight something that I think doesn't get enough play, and that is we are used to the idea of nature red in tooth and claw, but I don't think we emphasize enough our unique evolutionary ecology. So for roughly 3 million years, probably for more than that, human beings have lived in small bands on the savanna and had to evolve an ability to cooperate. This is very unusual among primates. Most primate societies, are rather like totalitarian dictatorships. There's relatively few happy primates, happy monkeys or happy apes. Most of them are constantly worried about getting beat up. It's like, you remember the worst days of grade school or junior high when you would just walk onto the playground and you'd be getting beaten up or taunted? Well, that's what it's like every day for many monkeys and many apes. Again, a statistic that's not widely known is that roughly 40% of all adult male chimps are murdered. You can imagine what that, what that does to your sense of security and happiness. But human beings have a unique opportunity for social happiness that most other primates don't. And that's because a lot of our really, shall we say, aggressive, let's say asshole tendencies have been somewhat tempered, not fully tempered, but somewhat tempered by evolution, so that it is possible for us to get along. Not guaranteed, not easy, but it's possible in a way that's very much less possible. Not, again, not completely impossible, but very much harder for most other primates. Now, I said we did this for 3 million years. We don't see a lot of cooperation nowadays. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about that among anthropologists and psychologists. But I think the consensus is that modern environments, where there's a lot of hierarchy, really give a lot of scope to our deeper ape mind, the Machiavellian mind that is, always looking for advantage and trying to screw the other person. And this, but it gives also a lot of scope for how can we improve our environments so that we don't enhance and promote the assholes. Is there a way that we can, construct our social environments so that that happiness has a better chance of coming to the fore rather than the Machiavellian dominance seekers? Well, I think that that's something that really is beginning to be addressed with brain science. And I'd like to highlight two things. So I think that this is a story that's just beginning to unfold. And I think in 50 years, we'll have a lot more to say about this. But I'd just like to highlight two surprising findings that shed, I think, a good deal of light on human nature even today. And the first is that, your brain has, as you know, many, many, many cells, billions of cells. But what you probably don't know is that in most brain areas, the cells are all competing with one another, trying to outshout each other. It's a little bit like an Italian wedding or a large Chinese family dinner party. Very, very noisy in there. And they're all sort of competing to be heard. And everybody's shouting and not many people are listening. And so that your brain is perpetually in a state of flux. The people who study these things mathematically call it dynamic instability, that you could perpetually turn in any of 100 different directions at any point. And you're constantly sort of, reining yourself in to keep yourself on track. So I think we should then understand that, human nature, human personalities are not fixed in stone. We are all very mutable and always and capable of many, different uncharacteristic behaviors. Another thing that I think is worth understanding is how deeply individually different we are. So one of the things we study in human brain evolution is how humans have evolved circuits that link together many brain areas that are not linked together in monkeys or even in many apes. But so this picture here sort of highlights the areas in red. So the picture on the right. So the picture on the left is sort of a picture of circuitry. It looks like a bit of like a psychedelic bicycle helmet, but it's actually a picture of all of the circuits just in the upper inch or so, upper inch and a half of your brain that link together many different parts of the brain. And human beings have more of this circuitry than typical ape, and more of it's linking many disparate different areas. And these areas that have expanded in evolution that are linked together with this circuitry are highlighted in red here. This is a sort of like a crumpled picture of a human brain. And what's interesting is that these areas that have expanded in evolution are also the areas that expand during childhood, during development. So these areas start out in your brain when you're born. These areas start out the same size as a chimpanzee infant's, but they grow preferentially. They expand much more during your early childhood. And what's interesting is that everybody uses these areas differently. If you are doing a task and your spouse is doing a task, or your sibling is doing the same task, if you were to put both of you in a scanner, you'd find out that you may be using, 5 of these areas over here to do the task, and your spouse or your sibling would be using 7 of these areas over there to do the task. So people develop individual idiosyncratic habits of using their brain in these cognitively more demanding tasks. And I think the lesson we can draw from that is that you should not expect anybody to think like you. That thinking, communicating it at all is a bit of a haphazard and somewhat almost miraculous process, that we can understand each other at all, but that we fundamentally think about the world in very different ways. And that's why it's important to have clear debate, as the Renaissance humanists were trying to do. So that's the second sort of what I hope will be the pillar of a new humanism. I'd like to articulate 2 more that I've not really fleshed out so well. And the first is, I think, a serious education in emotional intelligence, and taking very seriously both recognition of kindness and empathy and teaching of kindness and empathy. And I think a couple of you probably know about this program, Canadian program called Roots of Empathy, which is attempting to bring out, elicit empathy and thinking about other people's minds in grade school children by bringing in typically a mother and a young baby. And for reasons that are still not clear, that seems to sort of soften the defenses of even the most hard-nosed, tough kids. And to engage them in conversation about, what is this baby feeling? What do you think, what are they trying to communicate? And it seems to prompt thinking about other kids this way, that they are also more sensitive to how their actions impact other children. And there've been several outside studies which have confirmed that this program does reduce bullying in the schools. Not to zero, but certainly significantly. So I think it is possible to teach empathy or to educate empathy. And I think broadly, we might also talk about power relationships. How are certain kinds of people bullying or teasing others? to understand those kinds of things and give, I think many of us remember, at least, I was a nerdy kid and got beaten up by the jocks all the time. And, I wish I had a better understanding of human psychology to try to perhaps avoid that or help deal with it better. But I think understanding power and relationships is something that we're very, very poor at. That we almost declare that status and power are invisible, and yet in every animal species they're very, very visible. And I think that they're just more subtle for us. And I think that it's important that we learn how to recognize abuse of power or use of power in relationships. And finally, I think we really do need to understand the institutions and rules that would undergird a thriving society. I mentioned that most of the signatories to the first Humanist Manifesto were believers in socialism as the future of society, and more than a few were communists. The revelations about Stalin's show trials really shook the foundations of their faith in that kind of institutional socialism. But I think that we now have a good deal of empirical evidence about the kinds of social arrangements and economic institutions that actually do promote human thriving. And I don't think there's necessarily a single model, but I think there's many ideas. Some of you may know that Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize a decade ago for her work on how people, fishermen and other people who have a shared commons, which is vulnerable to overexploitation, how they might negotiate and find ways to prevent their common resource from being overexploited. So that kind of work, there's much more of this kind of work going on. Nobel Prize was given just a few years ago to Esther Duflo and Banerjee, I think, for related work on human institutions that promote economic thriving. So I think it's possible, again, I don't think we know the answers just yet, but I think it's coming out how we could have an economic system that is both just and distributes wealth, well, but also compatible with creativity and innovation. So again, that's the 4 pillars that I think the new humanism could have. And I'd like to ask a question, 2 questions really. Could this vision revitalize humanism? And I'll say yes. And for 2 reasons. One is that this kind of humanism, the first 2 pillars of this kind of humanism would really engage where the intellectual ferment is right now, where many scientists and futurists are thinking about where humanity might go. And second, I think that the second 2 pillars would address the real concerns of working people. So remember that, right now we're in a kind of crisis of meaning and of despair in the United States and to some extent throughout the Western world, where we have people who feel that their life lacks dignity and meaning, that they have very little impact on their local community. They don't have much power. They feel the elites are exploiting them. And they're not entirely wrong, but they need some sort of vision that, and some sense that humanism is working for them, is concerned about people like them. I think many of you may have read the essay, about 20 years ago, Not My Father's Religion, by a Unitarian minister who was asking what did his Unitarianism have to say to his father, who was a working class person who worked in a factory all of his life. And I think that's a question we should ask ourselves. So I'm going to end with a couple of other questions. Why not? Why haven't humanists embraced scientific approaches to human nature over the past generation? Why have we diverged There's much less discussion of evolution, human nature and evolution in, the American Humanist magazine than there were even 30 years ago. And why haven't humanists focused on the concerns of working class people? I mean, surely, dignity in work is a humanist concern. Socialism may or may not be, the solution. But why aren't we at least talking about that as an issue? Why are we, essentially writing that off? So let me leave those two difficult questions, and we shall stop that and open it up for final discussion and ideas.
Okay, well, Mark, you've given us a lot to think about and some questions. I'm just wondering whether we should just continue this broader conversation rather than sign into breakout rooms. But we are 20 people right now. Well, let's have a few questions. And if you would really like to have me break it in two, I can easily do that too. Maybe you can add your comment in the text. But who would like to address either the answers or the questions or a general comment? Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
When I think about your questions, I think about the fact that, in recent history here, just about everything has been politicized, including science, and yet people still hang on to the old idea that, to accomplish anything, you need to be nonpartisan. But, the right-wing fascist movement worldwide is really basically against science, for one thing, and against doing anything to help working people except giving them scapegoats, that being minorities. So I think one thing getting in the way is that to accomplish these things, I think you'd have to be partisan, you'd have to be liberal, you couldn't be fascist, and yet people still have the old idea that you have to be nonpartisan if you're not a expressly political group. And even if you decide that you're willing to be partisan, there's a lot of punishment for being partisan. There are lots of fascist attacks on universities for not doing what fascists want them to do. So there's that. And then I definitely think that the right wing is a much, 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 much greater danger, but there always also is left-wing political correctness. Not in that many places, I don't think, but particularly in some progressive organizations like the UU Church and in elite universities. And so that keeps people from embracing science because these left-wing groups are also against logic, rationality, science, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess I try not to deliberately provoke, people's shibboleths, but so in that sense, I'm trying to be nonpartisan. But I think it's fair to say, I don't have any sympathy for Donald Trump or for his what he advocates. I think that's fair to say. And I think many people who are traditional conservatives are also appalled by Donald Trump. And we have several friends who are very conservative. I wouldn't say they're right-wing or certainly not fascist. And I think many people from, all across the spectrum many thoughtful people are appalled by, that kind of ignorant approach to so many issues. I think that we need to understand is, whether we're liberal or conservative, we need to understand why so many people are, embracing the orange-haired Pied Piper and thinking that this lunatic speaks to them. And he's obviously, he's a marketing guru. He understands what kinds of things, make people behave in certain ways. He's an expert manipulator. And I think that he's identified some real crises that many liberals have not been willing to admit, not been willing to talk about. In particular, the sort of crisis of dignity of work. We think that everybody who, as long as people get, enough to live on and they get, better wages, what's to complain about? And I think Trump actually understands, what people are missing psychologically. And, his fantasy solutions are, complete nonsense, but I think he points, I think his success points to something that we on the left need to understand quite a bit better and I think that, even the socialists of the early 20th century understood that, I think, better than we do now. Okay. Dick.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that because I don't see that like Unitarian seminaries are even remotely in alignment with what you're talking about. I mean, you look at what the younger people that are coming out, it's the big emphasis is all on identity politics in very partisan ways, and in many ways very anti-scientific ways. I mean, you look at race and what's the thing they teach? All whites are racist. That's not a scientific fact. It's not even.
No.
And now it's all about gender. Are puberty blockers really the way to go? There's very poor science on that. So we have our what's coming out of universities and particularly UU seminaries is itself anti-science in many ways, not explicitly, but it's actually deliberately ignoring certain kinds of science that don't go along with the latest ideology of race or gender or identity. And I think we got a long ways to go in our own house, so to speak. And if we have people like you running our seminaries and saying, yeah, let's shift our whole focus towards global ecology and real human relationships, the real social science, you see, and how that can make a difference, and real biological science. But how do we do that? I don't see any.
Yeah, I think sadly I'm not likely to get a job as a president of any Unitarian seminary anytime soon.
Yeah, but that's what we need, you see, and we're not even close to there or in universities or anything right now.
I think you're right, and I think it's a sort of sad example of the effectiveness of certain kinds of political activism that you can effectively, by the threat of making a big stink on social media, effectively coerce a lot of people.
Right.
And I think certain groups understood this much earlier than most other people. That it's just universities hate bad publicity, and so if you threaten them with bad publicity, you can get a lot of ridiculous things pushed your way. And I think that's unfortunate. I hope that the left's fever is breaking. I think it's still at this point undecided, how things will turn out.
Okay, well, I guess what I'd like to do is to have a chance at breaking down. We have 18 people with us, and so that'll be two groups of 9 people. But before I do that, I'd like to really thank you, Mark. That was a really inspiring speech or talk, and it. I guess it did. I really like the breadth that you covered from our early days with this same kind of concept that we've been toying with as humans for a long time, and it certainly needs further evolution. So I would invite you to, when we break, I'm going to break out into the breakout rooms. We're going to just have 2 rooms, and we won't come back, and so the breakout group will end when you say goodbye to the other people in that breakout room. And but one other thing, I would like to promote the fact that the first NAU, it's a historical summit that's coming October 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th. And all the details are on the NA Unitarian site. And I hope that we'll see many of you there. And I'd also put in the text just a way that you can support the NAUA. And we haven't paid any of our speakers in any cash money. We're just very grateful for the time and energy they take, not only in being here, but in preparing the great talks that we've heard. All these Academy talks are recorded. They will be available. If you go to the naunitarians.org site, you'll see it in a couple of days, today's talk. So I think, just a final plug. I don't know if I mentioned it, but our October session is featuring Reverend Dr. Todd Eckloff, and he's talking about the future of the NAUA. So it'll be a precursor, I guess, to the summit. And that is on the second Tuesday in October.
Before we break, Terry, I think Julie has her hand up.
Oh, okay. Julie, have you got a quick question?
No, I don't have a question. I just want to clarify what I said, which I think is pretty different from what Dick said I said. I don't think that the Unitarianism is the Unitarian seminaries or the Unitarian leadership is normal. It is left-wing authoritarian. My point was that I think the left-wing authoritarianism is confined to certain particular progressive groups, including the Unitarian Church and some colleges, but pretty much only elite colleges, not the rest of them. And I think it's kind of rare, and I don't think this is very much espoused by Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. The way I see it, the right wing is very far. The right-wing people that are in power, the politicians in Congress, are very, very far toward right-wing authoritarianism. And the left-wing people who are in charge, who are in Congress, or the president or nominee, are not extreme and are not authoritarian at all. So anyway, just to be clear about what I see and stated.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So I bid you all good night, and except you can think about, humanism, past, present, and future, and share it with your friends, and maybe get to meet somebody new. And